pictures of various types of cells. You're going to see all of these over the next week or so. And cells come in a variety of shapes and sizes with various parts within them because different types of cells have different jobs to do, different functions for a living thing. Autumn?
How come there's, like when you look through the microscope, how come there's that black?
Yeah, this pointer, a couple people have asked about that. It's so that somebody can point something out to you. So like you can rotate that around and get it so like one specific thing is right at the end of the pointer, and then step away from the microscope and have somebody else look at it and say, look right where the pointer is. I want you to see this or that. So just to help show something to somebody. So first off, we've learned a little bit about cells back in our living things. We know that first off, cells are the basic unit of life. Sometimes called the building block of life. And where do we find cells?
Everywhere.
In all living things. In all living things. All living organisms are made of cells. And it really wasn't until the 1600s when scientists first started to investigate cells. Why was it then? Emma?
Because nobody had microscopes before that?
Yeah, it had to do with technology. It had to do with the use of microscopes and lenses. And that most cells are generally very small and require microscope to see. And so until people started to work with lenses and microscopes, they were not able to see many of these things. Okay? So one of the first people to really start to look at cells was a man named Robert Hooke. He was a scientist, did lots of different scientific experiments. He was actually the first to see cells. He had a microscope that is sort of the precursor to today's compound microscope, had multiple lenses. Okay? Didn't give him great magnification. It was between 20 to 30 times. It was the greatest magnification he could get with the microscopes he had. But it was big enough to see some cells. And so one of the things he looked at, he had a book. He published a book called Micrographia, which he illustrated many of the things he was looking at in his microscope. Many of them were sort of insects and things like that. But one of the things he looked at was cork. This is a piece of cork. So it comes from the bark of a tree. You know, it's what's used to make corks for wine bottles or a board like that. It's a soft, sort of porous wooden material. And it's made of the cell wall of many plant cells. And that's what he drew here. Okay? This is cork, and these are the drawings from his book, Micrographia. And you could see that when he took a very thin section of this cork, you saw it was made of a whole bunch of tiny little boxes. And he called those boxes cells. I don't know, I've heard conflicting stories about why he called them cells. Some people say they reminded him of the cells in a honeycomb, the little sections within a honeycomb. Others say it reminded of the small rooms in a monastery, which were called cells. But he's who we credit with calling these things cells. But these are not living. What you're holding there is non-living cells. It's sort of the remains of a living cell. Another scientist, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, he actually started making a different type of microscope. Doesn't look anything like a compound microscope. It was sort of a piece of metal with a little needle, and then you would embed one single lens. It was really just a magnifying glass. But he developed a way to make very small but very powerful lenses. And so he could get much greater magnification than Robert Hooke's compound type microscope. So Leeuwenhoek was the first person that's credited with seeing living cells. He looked at a lot of different things under his microscope. He looked at blood. He looked at pond water. He looked at plaque from in between his teeth.
Oh, yeah.
And what he saw was when he took that pond water and took a sample, he saw there were living things in that pond water. Single-celled organisms he was seeing. He drew them, he described them, he published his research. And so he was able to see living things where people didn't know that they had existed before. Okay?
How did he see the black on his teeth?
He like scraped it out from between his teeth, put it on a little thing, and then looked at it with a
How
microscope.
is it living thing?
Well, it has bacteria in it.
Oh, yeah.
And those bacteria are what he was seeing. Now let me just show you this website to give you an idea about the scale and the size of how big we're talking when we're talking about individual cells. So if we look here at this little website here, it shows us something. So obviously our scale here in meters or in centimeters or millimeters, those are micrometers. We're familiar with those measurements. You know, this is a coffee bean or a grain of rice, you know, a sesame seed, one of those small sesame seeds. Those are pretty small, okay? But again, those things are not microscopic, obviously. They're a couple millimeters. A grain of salt, small, but you could still see an individual grain of salt. Okay, a grain of salt's about 1/2 of a millimeter. How many micrometers?
500.
Yeah, 500 micrometers. So obviously we can still see that, still visible. As we get a little bit smaller here, okay, we can see some individual organisms. This is an amoeba. It's a single-celled protist. Okay, it's about 500 micrometers, and you could see it we look at these protists later in the year. When you look at the water there, and you can sort of see it looks kind of cloudy. They're very small, but you could see them. A little bit larger, paramecium, okay, is another living protist that we'll see. Okay, it's a single-celled organism. Then we start to get to some human cells. Okay, a human egg cell, a female egg cell, is actually the largest cell in the human body, and it's a cell that would be visible. You don't need a microscope, I guess, to see it. It's slightly visible. A sperm cell, the male reproductive cell, is much, much smaller. Okay. If we think about a skin cell, okay, about 30 micrometers. Now we're getting smaller. We can't see these things. We need the microscope. Red blood cells are even smaller. Within cells, we have chromosomes that are within the nucleus, yeast. And then we start to get in below the level of a cell, like mitochondria is a cell organelle, which we're going to be talking about. A lysosome is a cell organelle, part within a cell. This is a bacteria. Bacteria are the smallest living organisms. So again, now we're getting just to the fractions of a micrometer, very, very small. We can even get smaller. Below that, we have viruses. Viruses are very, very small. Okay, they're just tiny little packets of DNA, really. Measles, HIV, influenza. Okay, those are now on the scale of nanometers. Okay, if we continue to zoom in, we can get even smaller than that. Rhinovirus, which causes colds. Ribosomes are within cells, nanometers. Antibodies that help us, our immune system function, and transfer RNA, hemoglobin that's in our blood cells. Then we start to get into actual molecules, okay? Things like a glucose molecule, okay? That's small. A water molecule. Adenine is a nucleotide. And then we get even to the very small scale of individual atoms, okay? Carbon atoms. Now the scale we're talking here, these are below micrometers, below nanometers even. We have angstroms and picometers. Very, very, very tiny units of measurement. So that's kind of the scale we're talking here. Nicole?
On like the slide you showed the pictures, were the cells the tiny dots or the boxes?
The boxes. The boxes. The dots were the nucleus of those cells. Eli?
What does PN stand for?
Picometer. It's a very, very tiny unit of measurement. Morgan?
Would you need like an ultraviolet microscope?
Yes. For many of those things at the smaller end of the scale, yes. You can't see them with a compound microscope. Yes. Veronica?
My mom cut a leaf off one of the plants in our house and we put it under our microscope and we saw all the little cells.
Yeah. Yeah, you could see them. All right, let's try to finish cell theory here before we leave. Get your stuff out, class isn't over. Cell theory. There are three parts to the cell theory, sort of the overall rules that scientists have came up with related to cells. First, all living things are made of cells. At least one, often more. The second part, that cells are the smallest